There are moments in history when a warning doesn't come as a whisper, but as a shockwave, an inner jolt that tells you the world is about to shift. And the message isn't about a person we can name, but a force, a figure, a presence rising quietly in the backdrop of global uncertainty. I call him, not because we lack clarity, but because the identity is less important than the impact. Every era has a catalyst, someone whose influence can tilt societies, shape nations, or provoke spiritual awakening. The revelation you're about to hear is not meant to frighten, but to prepare, not meant to elevate fear, but to heighten awareness. What was revealed carries weight, urgency, and a sobering call to stand firm as the world approaches a defining moment. When the warning first arrived, it didn't come with thunder or theatrics. It surfaced quietly, almost too quietly, as if testing whether anyone was still paying attention. And that's the heart of the revelation. It comes at a moment when the world is so distracted, so overstimulated, so consumed with temporary noise that the eternal message almost slips by unnoticed. You know, there's something unsettling about how easily we allow ourselves to drift, not intentionally. Nobody wakes up saying, "Today I want to be spiritually numb." It happens subtly, a little more busyness here, a little more entertainment there, and suddenly the inner life becomes background static while everything else demands center stage. And this is where the revelation begins to take shape, because the message wasn't simply about a figure rising or a force gaining ground. It was about the condition of the people who were supposed to see it coming. Distraction becomes the softest form of danger, the most comfortable form of deception. It doesn't fight you, it lulls you. It doesn't threaten you, it numbs you. And somewhere in that haze, something starts advancing, quietly, steadily, strategically. Him, the presence described in the Revelation, doesn't rise in broad daylight. He rises in the shadows created by our divided attention. I want you to picture it, a world glued to screens, driven by urgency, fueled by comparison, pressured by expectations, overstimulated, yet deeply undernourished. People living in a constant state of reaction instead of reflection. Everything about modern life is designed to pull the mind outward, away from the soul, away from discernment, away from the deeper questions that anchor our decisions. And that's precisely when the warning becomes critical. Because if you don't guard your awareness, something else will claim it. If you don't choose your focus, something else will choose it for you. The revelation emphasized that humanity is not merely distracted. It is willingly surrendering the very alertness needed to discern the times. We are losing the ability to read between the lines, to sense when something subtle is shifting beneath the surface. We overlook patterns because we're preoccupied with pleasures. We ignore dangers because we're entertained. We downplay spiritual cues because they don't flash like notifications. And in that environment, almost anything can rise unnoticed. Influence doesn't need force when the people who should resist are too distracted to see it coming. There's a philosophical depth to this warning that we cannot afford to miss. Throughout history, every major turning point, every cultural shift, every moral collapse, every rise of deception has followed one common thread. People weren't paying attention. They were busy with life, consumed by comfort, trapped in routine, and into that inattentiveness stepped forces that reshaped nations and redirected destinies. That's why the revelation about him is not centered on the identity of a person, but the vulnerability of a generation. The real danger is not the rise of a figure, it's the fall of awareness. As the message continued, it became clear that distractions are not random, they are strategic. They weaken perception, they dull discernment, they lower resistance. When the mind is scattered, anything can influence it. When the heart is overloaded, anything can sway it. When attention is fractured, anything can dominate it. And that's exactly how subtle forces gain power, not by overpowering people, but by outlasting their attention span. The revelation highlighted that him is not just rising because he is strong, he is rising because people are not watching. There's also a psychological layer here that resonates deeply with the human condition. Distraction is attractive because it protects us from confronting the uncomfortable. It shields us from deep introspection. It numbs the uneasy truth that something inside us might need recalibration. When people are afraid of stillness, they become addicted to noise. And when they are addicted to noise, they become spiritually blind. That blindness is the atmosphere in which dangerous influence thrives. So the warning is not simply prophetic, it's deeply personal. It's calling each individual to reclaim their attention, their inner life, their ability to be present, aware, discerning. It's urging us to step back from the clutter, to reconnect with stillness, to sharpen our perception again. Because the moment we regain awareness, deception loses its power. The moment we become watchful, subtle influences can no longer hide. The moment we awaken, the shadows can no longer grow unchecked. And that's the challenge placed before us, not to fear what rises in the world, but to strengthen what rises within us, to recognize that the greatest danger is not him, the influence, the presence, the emerging force, but our own willingness to sleep through the signs. If we resist distraction, we resist deception. If we restore awareness, we restore authority. And when we finally look up from the noise, we may discover that the warning wasn't meant to frighten us, but to awaken us. Stay awake, stay aware, stay anchored. That is how you overcome the world that wants you distracted. Before the revelation ever described the magnitude of his influence, it emphasized the subtlety of his beginnings. That's what makes this warning so striking, not the dramatic rise, but the almost invisible entrance. And if you think about it, that is how most world-shaping forces begin. Not with an explosion, but with a whisper. Not with dominance, but with suggestion. Not with a declaration, but with a nudge. The rise of him, this symbolic figure the Revelation points to, isn't a sudden takeover, it's a gradual drift. Its influence built grain by grain, almost imperceptibly, until one day the whole landscape looks different, and no one can quite explain how it happened. And that's what the message is calling our attention to. It's not that we are incapable of recognizing danger, it's that we rarely recognize it early enough. Humans notice storms, but ignore the breeze that precedes them. We act when things are obvious, yet overlook the tiny shifts that make the obvious possible, and so the revelation shows us that the true danger is not the moment he becomes powerful, but the long stretch of time where he gains ground unnoticed, because the people who should have seen it coming were not watching the small changes. Let me put it this way. Great influence doesn't usually arrive as a lion, it arrives as a seed. Seeds don't look threatening. Seeds don't make demands. Seeds don't announce themselves. But given enough time and enough inattention, they grow into something that can reshape everything around them. That is precisely how this rising force gains dominance, subtly, quietly, beneath the threshold of alarm. It starts with the small compromises people make when they're tired, the small concessions they agree to when they're scared, the small values they loosen when society normalizes what used to be unthinkable. Influence doesn't seize authority, it collects it bit by bit until it no longer needs to ask. One of the deepest psychological truths woven into this revelation is that human beings underestimate incremental change. We recognize threats only when they become too large to ignore, but by then they've already established themselves. And so him, this figure of influence, grows not because he is charismatic or brilliant or even forceful, but because people gradually adjust to his presence. He becomes familiar, and familiarity has a strange power. It turns resistance into acceptance. What once felt concerning eventually feels normal simply because it's been around long enough. This is why the message warns us to pay attention to the early signs, the tone of conversations shifting, the values of communities bending, the expectations of society quietly rewriting themselves. None of it feels dramatic in the moment. Nothing seems urgent. But over time, these small adjustments stack up, and what emerges is a presence that now feels too large to challenge. You don't feel the weight of a mountain while it's forming. You only feel it once it's already there. You can see this pattern throughout history. The greatest cultural shifts never began with sweeping declarations. They began with subtle persuasion. A new idea introduced gently, a belief reframed gradually, a compromise offered kindly. People rarely surrender their convictions instantly. They surrender them slowly over many small decisions they don't recognize as surrender. And that is the psychological terrain in which this rising force thrives. He doesn't demand change, he influences it. He doesn't overthrow values, he erodes them. He doesn't create fear, he capitalizes on uncertainty. And the revelation makes an important distinction here. It does not portray him as some monstrous invader. No, the influence is far more philosophical than that. He represents the growing power of anything, any trend, any voice, any ideology that gains dominance through subtlety rather than strength. He is the embodiment of gradual drift, and the danger is not in the figure but in the process, a process that unfolds while people are too overwhelmed, too distracted, too exhausted to challenge it. But the heart of the message is not despair, it's empowerment. Because subtle influence is only effective when people are passive. It only grows unnoticed when people stop noticing. And that is why awareness becomes our greatest defense. When we choose to be intentional, when we examine the small shifts, when we refuse to normalize what weakens us, the quiet rise loses its power. What grows in the dark cannot survive once the light returns. So the challenge is simple but profound. Watch the small things. Pay attention to the direction, not just the destination. Question the subtle changes before they become the dominant reality, because influence may begin as a whisper, but so does awakening. Strength begins quietly. Discernment begins quietly. And the people who pay attention early are the ones who remain steady when everyone else is swept away. Stay alert to the subtle shifts, because what begins in a whisper can reshape the world. What struck me most about the revelation was not simply that he rises, but why he rises. Influence does not appear out of nowhere. It doesn't just materialize in a healthy environment. It requires conditions created by the absence of something that should have been present all along. And in this case, the revelation makes it unmistakably clear. He emerges in a vacuum of moral leadership. Not because he is strong, but because others have grown silent. Not because he is worthy, but because those who once carried conviction have grown weary or complacent. It is the void, not the villain, that sets the stage. And this calls for a deeper level of honesty from us, because a vacuum of leadership is never accidental. It happens slowly, almost imperceptibly, through a long series of quiet withdrawals. Leaders who once stood firmly begin to soften their stance. Voices that once spoke truth begin to tremble. People who once carried responsibility begin to retreat into comfort. It's a slow erosion, not a sudden collapse. And into that space, the space where conviction once lived, steps a presence that should never have had room to grow. You see, the revelation isn't warning us about the rise of a singular figure, it's warning us about the consequences of collective drift. When moral courage evaporates, something else always fills the air. Nature hates emptiness, and the human spirit is no different. If truth is removed, deception takes its place. If clarity fades, confusion steps in. If conviction weakens, compromise marches forward. Him, in this symbolic sense, represents anything that thrives when people step back from their responsibility to lead with integrity. This is why the message carries such weight. It's not pointing a finger outward. It's turning the mirror inward. The real issue is not that something dangerous might rise. It's that we often leave the door wide open without even realizing it. When moral leadership collapses, it doesn't leave a silent room. It leaves an invitation. And influences that once had no foothold suddenly find fertile soil. Think about history again. Every significant shift, every cultural upheaval, every spiritual decline began long before the world realized it. It began when good people stopped being courageous people, when leaders cared more about acceptance than truth, when communities preferred comfort over responsibility. That's when the vacuum was created. And the vacuum didn't stay empty for long. Something always stepped into it, something that promised ease instead of integrity, something that offered convenience instead of correction, something that appealed to fear instead of faith. And that is what the revelation is trying to highlight. Him is not the cause, he is the symptom. His rise is a reflection of what has fallen: clarity, courage, conviction, spiritual backbone. It's easy to blame an emerging influence, but far harder to acknowledge that it gained power because other voices sat down when they should have stood tall. There's a powerful psychological truth here too. Humans crave guidance. They look for direction, for someone to set the example, for something to follow. When healthy leadership is present, leadership grounded in wisdom, compassion, and truth, it anchors entire societies. But when that leadership weakens, people don't drift towards strength. They drift toward whatever is loudest, whatever is easiest, whatever demands the least from them. And that's how subtle influence becomes dominant influence. Not because it is inherently compelling, but because people are no longer protected by the clarity of strong leadership. So the revelation is more than a warning. It is a call, a summons, a reminder that leadership is not optional. Every generation must have people who stand for something, or else they will fall for anything. And maybe that's why the message feels so urgent, because it's not asking us to fear the rise of a figure, it's asking us to rise ourselves, to fill the space that should never have been empty, to reclaim the ground that hesitation surrendered, to ensure that the vacuum closes before it invites anything dark to dwell in it. And here's the good news hidden inside the warning. The moment moral leadership returns, the moment people anchor themselves again in truth and integrity, the influence that seems so strong begins to wither, because it was never strong on its own. It only appeared strong against the backdrop of silence. So let this be the challenge we embrace. Not to worry about who rises in the absence of leadership, but to become the kind of leaders whose presence leaves no room for anything lesser to grow. Stand firm, stand clear, stand courageous. Because the vacuum disappears the moment you step into it, what becomes increasingly clear as the revelation unfolds is that the influence he carries does not stem from genuine strength. It does not come from wisdom, authority, or moral clarity. It grows from something far more primitive, far more common, and far more dangerous: fear. Fear is the oldest catalyst of control. It is the emotion that bypasses logic, paralyzes discernment, and accelerates surrender. And the revelation paints a sobering picture. His rise is not the result of people believing in him, but of people being afraid of everything else. Fear is a strange thing. It doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It doesn't need to be justified to gain influence. It only needs to be felt. And once it is felt deeply enough, people will do almost anything to escape it. They will follow voices they don't trust. They will accept guidance they never wanted. They will trade their convictions for a sense of temporary safety. And that is exactly the psychological landscape that allows him, this symbolic rising force, to gain traction. The revelation describes a world shaken by uncertainty: economic uncertainty, moral uncertainty, relational uncertainty, spiritual uncertainty. When people don't know what tomorrow holds, they scramble for someone or something to give them answers, even if those answers are shallow. Fear creates a vacuum of stability, and he steps into that vacuum not because he is qualified, but because he appears decisive at a time when others appear confused. The authority he gains is not earned. It is absorbed from the panic of those who have lost their bearings. This is the same pattern you see throughout human history. People rarely choose leaders purely out of admiration. More often they choose them out of fear. Fear of chaos, fear of loss, fear of change, fear of being left unprotected. And so the revelation reminds us that fear-driven leadership is fragile leadership, but it is also dangerous leadership, because fear does not produce wisdom, it produces compliance. Fear does not create clarity, it creates dependence. And once people begin to depend on a force out of fear, that force does not need to prove itself. It only needs to remain the lesser threat in their eyes. But here is the deeper truth. Fear-based influence is always an illusion. It looks powerful, but it is hollow. It looks dominant, but it is reactive. It looks stable, but it is built on the instability of those who empower it. That's why the Revelation emphasizes that his rise is not the sign of a strong figure, but the sign of a weakened people. The more fear controls hearts, the more easily manipulation controls decisions. And if we're honest, fear is something every person, every nation, every generation wrestles with. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, fear of being deceived, fear of future outcomes we cannot predict. It's natural. But when fear becomes chronic, when it becomes the lens through which people view life, it doesn't just shape emotions, it shapes choices, it shapes values, it shapes allegiances. And in that state, almost any influence can feel like leadership simply because it speaks loudly when others are silent. This is why the Revelation's message is not simply about identifying the rising influence, but about dealing with the fear within ourselves. Because if fear rules the heart, deception rules the mind. If fear dominates thought, discernment disappears. And when discernment disappears, it becomes nearly impossible to distinguish true leadership from false influence. Fear is the soil in which false authority grows best. But the encouraging part is this: fear can be confronted. It can be dismantled. It can be replaced with something far stronger: faith, clarity, purpose, conviction. The Revelation is reminding us that fear-based influence loses its power the moment people stop feeding it. When you stop responding to fear, fear stops shaping your decisions. When you anchor yourself in something deeper, fear begins to shrink. And as fear shrinks, so does the influence that depended on it. This is why the message feels both sobering and empowering at the same time. It's sobering because it reveals how easily fear can take control of a culture, but it's empowering because it shows how quickly that control collapses when people reclaim courage. The rise of him is not inevitable, it is conditional. And the condition is fear, which means the real battle is not against a rising force, it is against the fear within us that makes that force seem necessary. If we learn to stand firm, he loses his footing. If we learn to see clearly, he loses his disguise. If we learn to live anchored, he loses his influence. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the refusal to be ruled by it. And the moment you refuse, fear-driven power begins to fall apart. What the Revelation shows next is one of the most profound truths about moments of crisis. They do not merely expose the world, they expose us. His emergence, this rising influence we keep referring to, does more than shift the atmosphere. It forces every person, consciously or unconsciously, to decide who they truly are. And that is the part most people overlook. We often assume that pressure only reveals external danger, but pressure is far more personal than that. It uncovers convictions we didn't know we possessed, and compromises we hoped no one would see. This is why the Revelation describes a dividing line, not a physical line, not a political line, but a line drawn in the inner life. When this influence grows, neutrality becomes impossible. You cannot stand in the middle anymore. You cannot hide behind vague beliefs or blurred values. Moments like this make it painfully clear that a person will either gravitate toward truth or toward convenience. And while people like to imagine they will always choose courage, experience tells us otherwise. When fear rises, when uncertainty thickens, when a powerful presence steps forward, many will look for the path of least resistance. But here's the deeper point. That choice doesn't happen in the spotlight. It happens quietly inside us, long before the moment arrives. The Revelation reminds us that no one suddenly becomes courageous in crisis. They simply reveal the courage they've been cultivating all along. And no one suddenly becomes compromised. They simply display the compromises they've been allowing to shape them in secret. His rise does not create weakness, it exposes it. It does not create strength, it highlights it. Choose with conviction. Choose with clarity. Choose with courage, because the moment you decide who you truly are, nothing rising around you can ever take that away. As the Revelation reaches its final stretch, a striking shift occurs. Not outward, but inward. The message stops focusing on his rise, on the shadows gathering, on the pressures forming. Instead, it turns towards something far more transformative, the resilience that awakens when people refuse to be defined by the darkness around them. And this is where the revelation becomes less a warning and more an invitation. It reminds us that the human spirit, when anchored in truth, is not fragile, it is formidable. What rises in the world may be strong, but what can rise within you is stronger still. This part of the message insists that resilience is not simply endurance. It is not just surviving difficulty, it is a profound internal shift, a decision to grow deeper rather than buckle, to stand firm rather than retreat, to move with purpose rather than react in panic. Resilience is the quiet strength that emerges when a person realizes they cannot control the atmosphere, but they can absolutely control their posture. And it is that posture that determines whether a person becomes a victim of the times or a force within them. What the revelation shows is that resilience begins in the inner life long before it becomes visible outwardly. It begins when someone chooses reflection over reaction, courage over fear, clarity over confusion. It begins when they stop asking, "What is happening around me?" and start asking, "What is happening within me?" You see, external threats only gain power when internal conviction grows weak. But when conviction strengthens, when a person becomes rooted, grounded, purposeful, the rising influence loses much of its grip. This is why the message keeps circling back to awareness, identity, leadership, and courage. These elements, woven together, form the foundation of resilience. They create a kind of spiritual and psychological immunity. Without them, people absorb whatever energy surrounds them. With them, they shape the atmosphere instead of being shaped by it. The revelation emphasizes that resilience is not built in calm seasons, it is forged in conflict. The very presence of pressure becomes the catalyst for inner growth. It pushes us to ask, what do I truly stand for? How do I respond when fear knocks at the door? What do I cling to when everything external feels uncertain? These questions are not meant to intimidate, they are meant to awaken. They invite a person to rise not after the storm, but in the very midst of it. There's a philosophical dimension to this as well. Throughout history, the greatest transformations in human character did not occur when the world was peaceful. They occurred when individuals faced something bigger than themselves. Pressure calls potential to the surface. Adversity reveals strength we didn't know we had. And that is exactly what this key point illuminates. His rise may create tension, but it cannot prevent transformation. In fact, it accelerates it for those willing to engage the moment rather than fear it. This is where the revelation becomes deeply empowering. It tells us that resilience is not reserved for the elite, the extraordinary, the gifted. It is available to the ordinary person who makes intentional choices day by day. It is available to the one who learns to quiet the noise and listen for truth. It is available to the one who dares to stand when others sit, to speak when others stay silent, to hold steady when others waver. Resilience is not something you wait for. It is something you cultivate, and the cultivation begins now. It begins in how we think, how we respond, how we prepare ourselves for both the seen and the unseen. We don't grow resilient by accident, we grow resilient by design. The revelation's final push is not a warning to panic, but a summons to prepare, not with fear, but with focus, not with anxiety, but with wisdom, not by resisting the darkness, but by strengthening the light within. Because the truth is, no rising influence, symbolic or literal, can overpower a person who has anchored themselves in clarity, truth, and courage. The world can shake, but the anchored soul remains steady. The atmosphere can shift, but the grounded spirit does not drift. The pressure can intensify, but the resilient heart only grows stronger. This final emphasis is not about predicting a world-shaping moment. It is about shaping ourselves to withstand whatever moment comes. So the revelation leaves us with this truth. Resilience is the quiet revolution within you. And once it rises, nothing rising around you can break what has already been fortified inside. Strengthen what is within, because that is the power no force can ever take.